Hello, my name is Hamlet Dobbins, and this is Memphis Material, an oral history project chronicling the stories of the visual arts in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis Material is a podcast celebrating the personal histories, the intimate stories, and the studio practices of some of the people who helped shape the creative landscape of our city. These unedited interviews are all recorded at the Memphis Listening Lab, an archival gem located in the majestic Crosstown Concourse in beautiful Midtown Memphis. The website for Memphis Material was designed by the wonderful Brian Dixon. Now, we don't really have sponsors for these shows, but if we did, today's episode, the second of two interviews recorded with Lisa Williamson, is figuring stuff out. For me, the great thing about talking to people about this process of art making is hearing how they work through ideas and think about things and think about their life and figure out ways of making both their studio practice and their life better. It was a delight to sit down with Lisa for this part two of two interviews. This one was recorded on March 22nd. 2024. Enjoy the episode. All right, let me see if we can do this again. I think everything is right. Okay. So I did pretty good last time. I didn't do too much sibilant affirmation. Not a lot of, okay, yeah, yeah. And so let me see. I got my alarm set so that it goes off in time for us to leave. Okay. And so I'm going to turn my mic off, because I don't think I did last time, but I'm going to try to this time when I'm not talking. And then will you do me a favor? Will you just tell me like what you had for breakfast? Just dumb stuff.
Yeah,
just talk.
Goodness. I had a big breakfast. I had eggs and kale and microgreens.
Wow. You always do those like smoothies too.
Yeah, I did have a smoothie.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah. I think we're good. Okay, so I did listen to it. I listened to the last talk. And so one thing I'm curious about is did you have anything where you like laughed and you were like, oh man, I can't believe I didn't mention so and so, or I didn't talk about blah blah blah?
Not that I could think of. I think in the aftermath immediately I was like, oh, I should have really mentioned, or I should have talked more about this, but no. And, it didn't stick with me, so it wasn't that burning, I guess.
Okay, that's cool. Well, one question I did have, I know that you mentioned some of the artists that you were looking at that Fred had recommended, but I wonder if there were others that maybe were particularly impactful, some other artists that were particularly impactful for you as an undergrad in terms of thinking about your work or your practice.
In undergrad, I think I was taking an oceanic class and Peruvian art history, so those classes were highly impactful from how the pigments were mixed, and that's when I was awarded the travel fellowship to Peru based on kind of borrowing from those classes. So maybe for quite a while they're not so much specific artists that we're looking at Eurocentric Western, because that's really a lot of what was being taught to us at that time still, but these other classes looking at what's happening with just the Peruvian art and textiles.
Okay. I don't remember you mentioning the Peru trip. Tell me about the Peru trip.
Yep. So, that's a fun story. I was my at graduation, right before graduation, we were, we could apply for the alumni travel fellowship. And I was really, I knew I had peers that were applying to go to New York or go to Paris, go to places to go look at art. And I was like, I want to go and make art. I don't want to just go look at shows. I want to be out somewhere where, I'm inspired to make stuff like right on the spot, go with a bag with my sketchbook and travel. And then and it was because of Betty Callow at the with my Andean art history class that I had studied Peruvian art, and then I applied for it, and I remember going into Bill Roberson's office and talking to him extensively about my application. And he and Henry Easterwood were super excited because, their love of textiles and fibers, that was a big program at our school that I loved with them. And so I was awarded the travel fellowship. And then the day that they announced it, it was at my graduation. And I thought, it looked like I won an Oscar or something. It was, I walked up on stage. I just saw, they started my slide presentation. They started showing my parts of my application because I had a lot of pictures in it. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I recognize that. And then they called me up on stage, and it was the person who gave me my fellowship. I believe it was specifically Alice Bingham, but it was Bingham, descendant from Hiram Bingham, who discovered Machu Picchu. And so they thought that would be really exciting for me to be presented this award by her specifically. And of course, then I go to Peru and I realize, how problematic Hiram Bingham was. And it really kind of changed my perspective on.
But now talk about this trip to Peru.
So I was awarded that fellowship in 2001, and I was scheduled to leave September 12th. So I did not go right then when I was supposed to. But that first trip was really that first trip that I had planned. It was on it was a very structured. Betty Callow had told me about it, and it was there was a strict itinerary to it. And a few years had gone by, and I had got permission to kind of hold off and wait on the trip until I felt comfortable flying. There was the Shining Path guerrillas were really active at the time that I was looking at going to, and so it wasn't safe for me to travel. And then I wasn't sure if I was going to be with my husband at the time going or by myself. I later learned that, yes, I was definitely going by myself and preferred that anyway. So when I went for 3 weeks backpacking alone. So that was a few years later. And and I just went with my sketchbook and completely, tossed the itinerary out the window. I booked my my hostels in Lima after I got to Peru, and then just went kind of week by week there. So I intentionally stayed in different parts of the city of Cusco, for instance, to kind of experience different parts of it. But when I first landed in Lima, I went to Arequipa first, and then took a bus to Puno, the highest navigable lake in Peru, and then stayed there for a few days. Went to the floating islands of Los Euros, and then I took a train from Puno to Cusco, and took a train all through the countryside there because the topography was something that I was really interested in too, where the cliffs kind of stopped at the ocean, and then you go through all this kind of desert land, until the eucalyptus trees start to grow. And so it was really fun because on the train, at a certain part when things start to turn green and you're getting closer to the mountains, you can smell the eucalyptus coming into the train car, and it was really magical.
Now, is that something that is travel a thing that was really important in your life before that trip to Peru? Mm-hmm. And that must have been a transformative thing. Just out of curiosity, was there any trepidation or any apprehension on your part of making this trip solo?
Travel that's not something that my parents ever would have done. Either one of them would never travel solo. They did not encourage us to travel solo. They were terrified about me going solo. I was getting really frustrated in my marriage at the time. My marriage ended right after that trip, but we were already separating, before I left for that. And it was really very metaphorical, with that. But I needed to go alone, and solo travel just kind of became what I was most interested in afterwards. That trip just getting the confidence that I needed. The only trepidation that I had was really the language, because, I'd studied Spanish, but I wasn't speaking it. My kids are part Mexican, but they didn't speak Spanish in my ex's house growing up, and we hadn't taught it to our kids, and so I had I took my my daughter's Spanish teacher out for coffee a lot, and he would invite me into like the dinners that he and the other Spanish teachers would get together, so that I could practice conversational. And for some reason, my brain just was not clicking the whole time. I'm practicing in the U.S. But once I got to Lima, it just sort of all clicked together, and then I was fine. And then I would get kind of frustrated because I would run into Peruvians who wanted to practice their English. So.
And so you make this trip, and so at this point you have your kiddos, and then how old are they at this point?
18 and 20.
No.
Oh, at that point, when
you went to Peru, I was like, wait.
They're old now. Let's see. How old were they then? 8 and 6.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so they were okay for you to cut out for that amount of time.
Yeah.
And so then when you finish with this trip to Peru, this is after you go to school, or you finish with undergrad. And so how are you navigating the world? How are you making ends meet as an artist with kiddos out in the world after you're done with school? How did that work?
So right before, I guess maybe it was 6 months before I graduated, I got my first mural job at Graceland, and so I joke with my students, I was cut the biggest check I'd ever seen, and was like, this is what I'm going to do if I can do this. And it was like $600. It was, this is like, I'm rich. I'm just gonna paint murals. but it came at a time that there were a couple of things that were happening that kind of made my profession sort of take off, or my career path sort of take off in that direction. I had September 11th hit not long after I graduated, so people weren't going anywhere, and they were investing in their homes, and so I was doing a lot of work in people's homes, and a lot of mural work, like residential, a lot of cabinets. I started faux finishing and doing decorative painting, but my specialty was like painterly finishes, oil techniques that had to be wet and remain wet, and they were really brushy. I wasn't doing, I started off doing some rag stuff, of course, and but these were much more, I was doing blending techniques and gradients up the wall, and won some awards for like the home shows, and I had done at home in Cincinnati, like a home that was used for commercials, and was on a TV program up there. And then so I got to travel around and paint, and so it was really just by word of mouth. One job led to another, and things started to build from there. So I was doing some, that mural work for Graceland, that led to mural work for a local restaurant, and then somebody walked by the restaurant as I was working. That led to my first residential. And then other people started to hear that I was doing residential, and I was getting phone calls that way. And then, when they would move, like Sarah Lee moved their home office, I think at one point, from Memphis up to Cincinnati. And I followed everybody up there and did their homes. And so I got to do that for quite a while. And then came back and did some more murals here, and then several of the people from Sarah Lee came back to Memphis, and I did their new homes here. So.
Wow. And so that was your main income for how many years?
Oh, probably at least 6 or 7 years. Yeah, I would say I probably made more money doing that than I make as a professor.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. At that age, I could easily make $2,000 a week. It was really, Yeah, it was really, and that was before I ended up hiring employees. I would go to Memphis College of Art and do these career talks and then have a couple students come and work for me. And, and then I had to be real careful because sometimes I was giving them the biggest check they'd ever seen and then I wouldn't see them again. So.
That's funny. Now, and so you were doing that. And so for 6 or 7 years, and then that takes us up to like what time?
Let's see. I really stopped when I got pregnant with Lily.
Okay.
Yeah, I was doing the mural at Peabody and Cooper across from the Midtown Yoga.
Okay.
And I was that was a fun one. I don't know if I've told you that story before about how that.
No.
This is how confident I used to be in trying to go out and get these jobs. I saw just a blank wall, and I was wanting to paint murals, and I learned that I think it was Terry. I can't remember his last name, but he owned Blue Light Studio, and I had heard that he had hired an artist to paint the wall out there, and so I kind of eyeballed the measurements of the wall. I went home and did a drawing that I was confident was going to be way better than any mural that anyone else was going to put up there. And then I walked into his office just out of the blue, hadn't made an appointment or anything, or called first. I was like, I have a design for your wall outside. I really want to paint a mural out there. I want that wall. And he's like, well, I already hired someone. And I said, well, whatever you're paying them, I'll do it for cheaper. And he's like, that's impossible. I'm paying them $500. And I said, I'll do it for free. And so but he had to agree to my design. And so I sold ad space on the side of the wall, and I got my scaffolding donated, and I went down to Farrell Calhoun and worked with the company, because they're locally owned, and got my paint donated by them. And I put everybody's name, incorporated into the design on the side of the wall. And I made enough on that mural to put a down payment on my first house. But it was on that mural that I had to set up the scaffolding. And I remember it was really scary because it was like partially off the curb because the sidewalk was too narrow. And so I had to like put all these boards under one edge of the scaffolding. I would climb up to the top. And I remember one day just feeling really, really nauseous. And I'm like, oh, this is terrible. I feel so sick. And then I climbed down and took a pregnancy test. And
Now, when you're doing this, I mean, it's 6 or 7 years. And so you've got all this stuff going on. Are you able, I mean, like part of me wants to think, okay, so were you keeping your studio practice, but I know that can be as creative an outlet and use and scratch itches in the same way that, like, air quotes, painting or art can. But were you thinking about it that way?
Once I switched over to painting on brick, because that's so different than canvas and paper, I really kind of looked at it for a few years as, and especially the glazing with the oil and that sort of thing. I really started to look at it more as like a continuation of my education. I didn't feel like I was coming in as an expert in how to do any of these finishes. I was kind of learning as I went and treated it as like, this is just kind of my self-imposed education. I'm going to continue to learn how to do this. And at some point I will have time for my own studio practice. And, I was married to someone who wasn't really supportive of me just having a studio practice, didn't completely understand what that meant. It was more of you have to be making an income from this. You have to be bringing money in. So I did have a part of a studio of practice. It started to kind of transition into studio practice during my pregnancy. I started picking up my sketchbook again and doing more things just for myself. And then, but I knew that I was going to have to, like, you got to plan a show from this. You got to make sure that you're selling art if you're having a show to be able to justify why you're doing this work, so there was always a thought in my mind, like, you're doing what you have to do right now to help contribute and pay bills and that sort of thing. And, just look at it as education, continued education for the time being. And there will come a time when you could go back to your studio and make your own things.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, what about thinking about community? What kind of things were happening in town? Were you plugged into that kind of thing, or were you aware of that kind of thing? Or was it more like, I'm doing these things and that's my world?
Community, yes, but way different community than I'm plugged into now. I wasn't really plugged into the art community, but, new mom, thinking about things that a lot of parents are concerned with. I'm taking my kids to the Children's Museum, to the Botanic Gardens, the big backyard was opening. I was concerned about education. So in the moments when I was developing my studio practice by the time my second daughter was born, but just as I was getting ready to have Izzy, I'm trying to think of the timeline here. I was opening a school. I opened a school right after she was born, but we had started working on it about a year before. So I guess that was when Lily was still, they're only 20 months apart. So Lily was still really little when I met my friend Delilah, and we decided that we wanted to open a school together. Our kids were about the same age, and when I wanted it to be just kind of a sweet, nothing real big, but just a few families involved. And then we got together because I'd been working on another project prior to that called the Junkyard Museum, and I worked on that for a long time. We used to do the Rock and Romps, like do art projects at the Rock and Romps and that sort of thing. We had a summer camp with Donald Knack where he made a big percussion sculpture with the kids, and then collage dance before they were collage dance. Like, they came out and choreographed a dance routine while another musician had composed a piece for the percussion sculpture. So yeah, I was very involved with like the Broad Avenue community for a while there, because I ended up having a studio on Broad for a little bit. But prior to that, we were talking about the Junkyard being over there in one of the low buildings, the warehouse that ended up with the water tower, painted water tower. And
No, what was the Junkyard? What was this?
It was so when I was doing my decorative painting stuff, one of the students that I had was from St. Louis, and she had told me about this like awesome museum you need to go to. It's not a children's museum. It's really kind of built more for adults, called the City Museum, and it was architectural salvage. And so I went maybe like a couple weeks after she told me about it, and then I came back, and my dad, who was a CPA and raising money for startup companies, and I was like, what do I need to do if I wanted to, spearhead something like this? He was like, you need to write a business plan. So I did. I taught myself how to write a business plan. I became an established 501c3. I established a board of directors and an advisory board. I spent 1 year going around the community and just asking for advice from like Roger Knox at the zoo, and I had a letter of support from Jack Bells, and Henry Turley. Had a really funny conversation with Henry Turley, trying to just kind of gauge, should this be a for-profit, should this be a non-profit, what part of town would this be most successful in? And then I started being introduced to potential board members from there who are still my friends to this day. But yeah, it was a climbable sculpture park made out of architectural salvage. And I think at that time, my naivety really was just that I wasn't sculpting myself. So I'm doing small maquettes of things, but it was really, really hard for me to take that next step into building something that, or even envision something that could be a little bit more on the permanent side. And then I think there was some arguments within the board as to like what part of town. And of course, when I'm learning this now with the latest project that I'm working on, again, reminded, I should say, like how difficult real estate in the city can be when you're trying to find the right location. And sometimes the location you can afford is not going to be the location that people will come down to. You know, I remember hosting a summer camp on Broad Avenue where City and State is now. And we had a sold out summer camp, and one of the parents showed up and said, nope, we didn't realize you were located here. This was like, you know, Broad Avenue's already on the upswing. And they were like, no, we're you know, we want a refund because we're not going to stay because it's Broad Avenue, it's Midtown.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so what ended up happening with the junkyard project?
Well, I had, after my divorce, I took a little break from it, about a year, and then and we had done all these kind of feasibility study type, you know, projects, and I had Robert Lipscomb ask me into a meeting with some other city planners and asked if they could take my business plan. It was like a 50-page business plan. Can we put this on the fairground redevelopment plan? I said, okay. And then he was like, well, we're going to want you to sign a non-compete. And I was being encouraged by a few people, not actually like board members, but other commercial real estate agents. Yeah, sign the plan. And of course, I was kind of dumb at the time and didn't, you know, recognize maybe what their intentions were but they just said, you know, we're putting you on the plan. This is happening. You're going to get the money. We're going to lease the building to you for $1 a year, the same sort of thing that the Children's Museum did as they were getting started. And so I was like, that's great. You know, let me know when we can, when this is like a solid thing so we can start our fundraising push. And, but I was always hesitant to go for a big ask of anybody because I didn't want to, how do you ask someone for, you know, $1 million donation when you don't even know where the building's going to be or where the location's going to be. Some people just don't want to put their money in certain places. So, so I signed the non-compete, and then I waited and waited and waited. And maybe about every 6 months, someone from Lipscomb's office would call and say, you're not talking to anybody else, are you? You're not putting your project anywhere else, are you? No, I'm waiting to see what's happening with the fairgrounds, and then, that's just kind of how it went for quite a while. And the kind of the last straw for me was going into I want to say it was a meeting that we had at the Coliseum, maybe with several people, where I noticed that, you know, they had this big map up of the fairgrounds, and they had all the stakeholders. They were calling me a stakeholder, but they had all the names of the stakeholders up, and mine was just a very general, like, children's entertainment. I was like, wait a second, you know, it was still going to be really hard to fundraise if you're not using our name, and it's, you know, we're not being published in the newspaper like everybody else is. So that's when I was like, this is not gonna. And by that time, I just felt like I was losing steam. It was such a big project. I just thought, I don't know that I can continue to pursue this. I worked on that for 10 years, and we never were able to really kind of find the right spot to be. So when Chris Reyes started his Exploratorium, you know, he and I had been talking for quite a while. He knew about my project for years, and I knew when he was starting up his. I just kind of gave him, you know, the advice that I could come up with, things that I had learned along the way. Did my little postmortem with him, like, understand that, you know, you make it push back from here. Here's where you'll see some success, and just kind of like pass the reins off to him, I guess, along with some of my board members who wanted to fund it still, and so they were able to give him some money to do Exploratorium.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Goodness. Okay, and so you're doing all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when does graduate school happen?
Let's see. That was right as I would say graduate school was about really when I kind of, okay, I'm done with the junkyard and more, and like grieving that. I spent a long time grieving that along with the end of my marriage. So that was in 2013 when I enrolled in grad school.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, hang on a second. Straight up.
Having a party.
All right, cool. Okay, so what made you decide to go back to grad school?
I had always wanted to go back to grad school. I shouldn't say always. I didn't for a while. You know, it wasn't really, we didn't really talk about it a whole lot in undergrad. There weren't a lot of conversations like, what are you doing after undergrad? You know, I'm just like, I'm going to go be a professional artist and make that work somehow. But I did have one friend of mine that I knew had gone on to grad school, but it just wasn't a further conversation for most of us. And I was thinking about it and trying to determine like what the benefits would be. And I really got to a point after getting back into my personal practice, after my kids were a little bit older, thinking, I think I really want to go to grad school. I feel like there's a lot more that I need to learn, that I've kind of hit my wall as to what I can do on my own, and really want some instruction for this. And also I had successful, quote unquote, successful shows, whatever that means, you know, but sold out art shows doing work that I knew people wanted to buy, you know, kind of knowing the Memphis market and the venue that I was going to be showing. And it just wasn't very fun for me. Money's not what motivates my practice. So, and there were pretty pictures. And so everything felt so ugly going through the divorce that was like, I just want to go hide out somewhere and make some really bad and ugly art for a while and figure out what that means and what that does. I'd never seen anything that was really intentionally, I mean, I'm sure I had, but maybe wasn't doing the research or close enough looking, you know, to really see art that was really kind of connecting to what my feelings were at the time. You know, it's like, yeah, we can see, I don't know, Guernica and Scream and, you know, kind of the things that you're going to see in your art history classes back then, and not really looking at, I mean, we didn't do a whole lot of contemporary art unless it was coming directly from our professors, you know, through Xerox copies. So yeah, I was just kind of really hungry for, you know, to just be selfish with my art. I felt like that's what I learned backpacking in Peru, was just to really like, you know, make some time and space for myself and do this for me. And of course, my, you know, in talking to my ex, when we were getting closer to the end of our marriage, I started to play around with the idea of grad school, and he was just like, no, absolutely not. You know, you have to, I'm going to travel 3 weeks out of the month, and who's going to stay with the kids, sort of thing. And yeah,
that's not going to work.
No. So I was already trained to be a single mom at that point. I was already trained to be a working single mom, because I was like doing the museum and the school and a studio practice, and like he would just kind of come and go. So I'm like, well, I got this. This will be easy.
Now, we didn't really talk about the school that much. Mm-hmm. What was going on with the school? I'm curious about how that fit in.
That was, so really what I was doing, the junkyard was like a project that I was really, you know, pushing and making the sculptures for, and the models, and, you know, exhibit drawings and that sort of thing. And the school began as the idea of Dalila Early's, and we just thought we would open the school together. And I had this experience with the junkyard writing business plans, so that's kind of what I started doing was, you know, and I did it for a few smaller businesses after that too, but it was like, it's just a formula, and if you follow the formula, it should work. So I wrote a business plan for this Reggio Emilia school that was, and we one of my consultants for the junkyard happened to have opened a Reggio Emilia school in the DC Children's Museum. It was the first certified Reggio Emilia school in the country, and she lived on Overton Park, and she had worked for was working for Johns Hopkins, and so we brought her in as a consultant, and and I wrote the business plan, and we got our we couldn't get accredited through Reggio Emilia, but the idea behind the school was that it's the idea that all learning begins visually, that it begins, the kind of the artist environment. So you have the atelier where the students are invited to explore materials. We use that word specifically, invitation, to explore materials, different types of materials, high quality, not kind of not throwaway craft stuff, but some really good quality art materials. And then it was student driven, so and project based. So the students would sort of determine what it was that they wanted to study, what they wanted to learn. We started off with 2.5 to 5 year olds, and it eventually went up through high school. So, and then I ended up stepping out kind of early on because we were having a lot of growing pains. And at one point, since she and I were sort of spearheading this, and we were kind of like locking horns, and I was like, well, I can stay in this and ruin our friendship completely, or I can step out and we can maintain our friendship still. And so I stepped away. I just wasn't really thrilled with some of the decisions and those growing pains that were happening. And so I just kind of was like, okay, well, I feel like I did the part that I was supposed to do, which was to get the doors open. And that was the part that I had some experience at, with, putting the plan on paper, and other people can take over from here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you ended up going back to school. And so at this point, they are downtown. They have the grad studios downtown. Was Memphis College of Art sort of a logical choice because you were here and your kiddos were here, and there was sort of a life and support system and everything?
Yeah, I had a divorce decree that said I had to stay.
Okay.
In Memphis.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would have loved to have picked up the kids, and my parents were. Well, this was another part too. My parents were living in Indianapolis at the time, and then Chris and I decided to divorce. And then the day I called my parents to say, we were divorcing, they announced the news that they had sold their house and were moving back to Memphis. And then I was like, oh, shit, I guess I'm not going anywhere then. So because they were like, we want to be closer to our grandkids. And, I'm the only kid that's got grandkids. So, so I felt a responsibility to stay here for them. And then I think I probably could have made an expensive argument against my ex on like leaving the city, but I just thought I'd make it work.
And MCA was a totally different place then. I mean, that was 12 years later.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was a totally different place. And so going into it, I mean, I imagine there were some things that had a kind of familiarity to them, but then there was also this radically new building, a whole new staff, a different president, maybe times two. And so I'm curious, who were some people that you found yourself gravitating towards when you were there in grad school?
Well, I graduated with my undergrad technically in painting, and then grad school was much more open, of course, to us playing around with a lot of different things. So Elizabeth Brown was someone I really connected with. Our grad director at the time was Haley Caffiero. So even just I didn't get an opportunity to work very closely with her, but I did go on a study abroad with her and got to see her as her work was going viral, and kind of making a note of like, okay, this is how she's navigating this. These are the people she's talking to. And I thought that was really fascinating, and she had a lot of good advice and a lot of advice that I just kind of ignored in the direction for my work.
Now, where was the study abroad?
Paris and Belgium.
Okay, now
in Brussels.
Had you been to those places before?
Mm-mm.
Okay,
Mm-mm.
and I mean, I would imagine that was pretty bonkers. And so, what were some things that were there some particular things that stood out from those trips?
So we went for a portfolio class, and it was we were had to do leave behinds for galleries. You know, how do you want to present your portfolio? How do you want to be remembered? You know, as after you present your portfolio and walk out the door. And so we were doing some critiques and things like that at Beaux-Arts, and I brought at the time I was doing a lot of now, you know, in my artist talk I mentioned this too, that it was very like trauma response type work. It was definitely like really dark, and you know, that was when I had made a wedding dress out of toe tags from a morgue, and they were soaked in blood, and cause of death I wrote my wedding vows on them, and I was wearing it around the school. And so I, you know, that was part of my portfolio when I get to Paris. And then when I've constructed this little leaf behind, I made a pillbox out of pink concrete, you know, because I was working around these ideas of like rejecting domesticity and, you know, the traditional like wife mother role. And so I had this pillbox made out of concrete with some lace kind of embedded, and then it was hinged, and it had my I had made a mold for it that had my website and my email address and phone number and everything on it. And then when you open up the pillbox, I had my flash drive was the shape of a pill, and so then when they plug it in, they saw all my work. But immediately it was, you know, I was told to, if all that was on our itinerary was to do these big museums, to skip like the Louvre, for instance, to bypass that and go to the Halle Saint-Pierre, which was the Art Brut in Montparnasse. Was it Montparnasse or no, Montmartre, to go see the outsider art. And that changed everything for me. Of course, I'm like thinking about Paul Klee and Jean Dubuffet, and I was looking at them in undergrad, but I don't know. And I was remembering those, but seeing like Paul Toupet, and then some of the being exposed to the Prinzhorn collection. I'm learning about the Prinzhorn collection at the time, and that was really resonating with me.
What was it about that work that clicked for you?
It wasn't pretty. It was like, it was like, okay, this is like really, I'm feeling that it kind of gave me permission to start expressing these really darker. I think it's not just art that I was, that's kind of like my whole background, you know, like being a dancer, being an artist, you have to have this facade that's always like perfectly put together, you know, the high curled ponytail and the lipstick just perfect, and your clothes just perfect, and the art has to be perfect, and you know, and it's just this kind of like everything's got to be pretty and perfect. And I was just so mad at that moment, like, well, none of that worked out for me. Look where I'm at now. None of that's real anyway. And it was really just kind of earth shattering to me that I'm seeing these artists that are like depicting how I'm feeling inside. You know, I'm struggling with depression, struggling with PTSD. You know, I don't want to pathologize my work, you know, but also I'm just like, this is really, really hitting something for me because it just feels more real.
And then were there particular pieces that you have in your brain in terms of thinking about Klee and Dubuffet?
Dubuffet, I think the piece that my brain goes directly to is the piece in Chicago, like the public art in Chicago, just because you're able to walk around. I think for him it was like the imperfect line, the imperfect shape. With Klee, there was like one piece in particular, and of course I'm going to forget the name of it, but it was, but I did a woman version of it. It was kind of like this man standing still, sort of this almost like tiny line drawing of just this man kind of off kilter a little bit. And it was more of like the relationship to the Princeton collection too, and reading about that history and how they were looking at pure art from, these institutions, which again is another super problematic thing as well. But yeah, I think it was just the general drawing style. I think when I'm looking at art, I'm not always honing in on one, like, this is the piece, I'm flipping through, looking at patterns, patterns of line quality, patterns of shape, so my head feels almost like a Rolodex when I'm thinking about specific artists. Like, I could identify a Dubuffet and identify a Clay because of the line work, but those two pieces in particular, that public piece that I could walk around, and then just that little bitty figure. Mm-hmm.
And so when you were there, you made this trip as opposed to the Louvre, and then what was the other thing that they said for you to bypass? Was it the Pompidou?
Oh no, I went to the Pompidou. Yeah.
Right. Now,
No.
were there some other things that you saw there that were particularly impactful?
At the Pompidou?
Yeah, anywhere.
Oh yeah. Let me think. I don't know if I'm trying to think of Olympia. Olympia was at the Pompidou. Yeah, I mean, I didn't hear a lecture on that until, years later in the PhD program on Manet's Olympia and the whole, like, postmodern conversation around that. But that was, I really hadn't seen good installation art in person until I got to the Pompidou. And then the Pompidou, was just like the scale of everything was overwhelming. And again, usually when you're with groups, you have such a limited amount of time to really take it all in. I mean, I'm always like the first one in the group to walk in and the very last one lingering. They're like looking for me on the way out the door. But just slowly looking at these, like, just in complete awe of the scale of the pieces. I think what happens too, I have a sketchbook from that trip. But I will end up writing the artist's name down, and then once I write it down, it's almost like it doesn't commit it to memory. It kind of like flies right out. So, but I remember, these gradually, these big globes that were kind of gradually getting smaller, and then each one was sort of treated in I think one had water in it. I wish I could remember even like what the artist statement was around that, but I think it was just the material and the scale that I hadn't seen anywhere before.
And then was that really early in your grad time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, because it's a 3-year program?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so who were some people that were in your cohorts? Because for me, that's such a critical part of grad school. Were there some people who were particularly important for you that you were connected to?
Justin Bowles, absolutely. Justin's got that great public art piece out in front of our school now. Justin was big. Anna Roach, we were studio neighbors. So I love everyone that I was in the program with, but Anna and Francis, Barry and I, a lot of late night conversations. Francis, the whole Where is Francis kind of developed as a result of us and wondering where the hell she was for every grad sem class when she'd come rolling in on her roller skates.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Now, what about, we were talking before about how a lot of the faculty had changed radically. Mm-hmm. Who were some people that you worked closely with during your time as a grad student?
Tom Lee. Yeah, he was, and Tom Lee was...
he was there when you were there before.
He was there, but he was my Foundations 2 professor. And then, once you declare what direction you're going, you don't see anybody, the rest of the time you're there. So I was only with the painters up in painting. And he and I had always wanted to work together, so he was one of my advisors. And so I worked very closely with him, and he was fantastic. He was, I was doing a cardboard class with Elizabeth Brown and constructing a large kinetic carousel that was going to be out at the Botanic Gardens, and it moved with the wind, and I was trying to figure out like how am I going to get it to move in the circular, and I constructed it. It was about 6 feet in diameter, and I constructed it to be almost like a jewelry box with a ballerina on top. I kept thinking of, so Tom and I worked on these ball bearings. I might have mentioned this to you before, those ball bearings made out of cardboard, where I learned just how scary the lathe is when something splits, because I had laminated several sheets of cardboard, and then Tom is like, yeah, just do it, but put it on the lathe. And so I did, and we're shaving the cardboard down into these, circular balls, and then one wasn't fastened quite right, and it just split and flew across the room. So,
Now, I had never worked with Tom as a student, but I know that just from knowing him that he's particularly funny, and that he is also sharp in his insight. Like he's a quick one to say the thing.
Yeah.
And just out of curiosity, what was it like working with him? What do you feel like? What do you feel like it was that he added to the grad experience?
Well, when I was an undergrad with him, what immediately connected me to him was we were sitting in class, and everybody was, it was like first day of class. Everybody's really uncomfortable. We're, like eyeing each other up. Still don't know each other very well. And somebody's rolling this metal cart down the hall, and he just, in his like really quiet, he's like, bring out your dead, bring out your dead. And that's all. And nobody in the class got it. And I just kind of chimed in, but I'm not dead yet. And then the two of us burst out in laughter, and realized we were Monty Python fans, and so, yeah, we just kind of were like, okay, we'll keep an eye on each other throughout the program. We're always friendly. And, but then when I went back to grad school, and he was the first person I chose to be on my grad committee, because I just was like, well, I think, I love how experimental he is, and how he's just kind of got this like go for it attitude. Go for it, even if it's going to fail, even if it's going to split and fly across the room. Let's try it and see. I've never done it before. Why don't we do this together? I really loved that. I really loved that he kind of behaved as though he was learning from us in the process of teaching us too, and was really open to that. And that was really, really special. So I think that was one of the biggest things that I learned from him, not just as a student, but, even now as a professor myself, just like, yeah, let's try it. Let's do it. Maybe we fail mindfully at it, but we can do this together, and I'll be hands-on, with these projects too, and we'll see what happens. But he was very much like that.
Now, what about the other professors? Were there other people that you were close with in your time as a grad student?
Yeah, Keith Corson. He taught our. Let's see, what did he teach specifically? He taught our biopic class, or biopic. We said it both ways, where we were reading, biographies and then watching the film to see what the similarities and differences were. But I loved his classes because they were so, because of the critical thinking component too, and the conversations, and just how they were structured in a more conversational way. And then, my classmates and I would get together for our movie night, in different homes to prepare for the class, which was a lot of fun. But Keith, I ended up having him on my committee to help with my thesis paper. And he was a PhD in film studies from NYU, and Keith is really what got me excited about pursuing a PhD, considering a PhD, because the conversations we would have around thesis or in class, I just felt like when I was getting ready to graduate, I really wanted those conversations to continue. And so I started researching programs where I might be able to continue that component, because I loved writing papers. It's crazy that sounds. I love writing papers. I love researching and reading, and I just, and I just wanted to be as well versed as he was in talking about his subject matter.
Okay. And then, what do you feel like grad school gave you in terms of not just your work, but also in terms of your attitude? Like, you touched on a bunch of that, with Keith and with Tom. But I'm curious, like, what do you feel like happened as a result of the grad school? Like, if you could go back and be like, okay, young Lisa, this is why you need to go to grad school, because you're going to get this and this and this.
So all throughout the grad program, because I was going through the divorce and doing all this work that, I'm trying to kind of push through some trauma, and then how do you depict trauma without it being re-traumatizing, for myself or other people. It was a really, really emotional journey. And so, even now seeing students play with that, I kind of cringe, like, oh, they just have to go through it though. But that said, like, every critique, I was tearful up until my last semester. I mean, it was just like painfully hard to even address or talk about some of the things that I was wanting to make work about. And so that did something to me as far as making me unsure about whether I was pursuing the right path, doing the right thing. That whole imposter syndrome, should I even be here? Am I supposed to be here? And I remember, Tom, I'm preparing for my thesis defense. And so for our thesis defense, I know that you were on some committees too, and I don't know how everyone else did theirs, but I knew my thesis paper. Like, my whole defense was like, I had my whole entire paper memorized. So I went through like this whole, when we were talking about it, I mean, I'm just picking out big swaths of the paper. And so as I was kind of preparing for it, because I'm trying to think, they had asked me to specifically give a presentation. It wasn't conversational. And I remember telling Tom like how terrified I was, and he was like, look, you're about to cross the threshold here. You've been student. And once you do your defense, like, you step up to get ready to do your defense, you are the expert. You're crossing over, and you are the expert of your work. So when you're talking to us about it, you're the expert. And something about that just clicked in my brain and gave me the confidence that I needed. Maybe I'm not an expert about anything else in the whole world, but I can be an expert about this body of work right here. And and that just really, I still carry that with me today. Maybe I'm not always confident when I'm starting a new project, or if I'm trying to, now I kind of like wait for it to tell me what it is, but I'm confident it will come. I'm confident that if I sit down and write about it and talk about it, that I can help collaborate, shape it into, something that's, that makes sense. But I think that was the biggest thing for me, was just having these, like, the ideas, the practice, the purpose sort of crystallize. And then in my brain moving forward, I just thought, like, okay, I did that trek through Peru a while back. I did grad school. I want to travel and make art. That's what I want to do. I want to travel and make art. I want to do residencies. I want to, I wasn't like feeling compelled to sell work like I did when I first graduated from undergrad. It was like, I just need to make. I'm not really as concerned with who sees it.
And do you feel like there were other relationships with other teachers that were particularly impactful? Because, I mean, at that time, MCA had kind of not necessarily changed its faculty structure, but I know for the grad school, it was relying on not necessarily like an adjunct thing, but it was almost like a contract thing where different people from the community would come in and they would work with different students for a semester or sometimes for their entire time there. And so I'm curious, I mean, obviously, the two that you've mentioned were faculty. What about some of the other people that you worked with?
Keith was one of those who were kind of,
Okay.
contracted. Rashetta Watkins, oh my gosh, that History of the Civil Rights and Photography class, hands down one of my favorite classes. And she does a one-woman show as Ida B. Wells. She was incredible. I loved her class.
Now, what was so good about that class?
Just opening up the dialogue. She's teaching to predominantly white students, talking to us about the civil rights movement. And there are students in there who are very privileged and giving some pushback that was very controversial. And just to hear her, calmly reframe, and I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, I'm never going to think about this the same way again. And I'm definitely carrying this forward to be looking at all these other things in a much more critical lens. Also, like, she had class at like Central Barbecue, so that was a lot of fun. We were right downtown, so we walked over to the Civil Rights Museum for class, go to Central Barbecue afterwards, and it was just a really, I don't know, it felt more like topological, I guess. Like, we're in the neighborhood, we're in the area, we're sitting in this, like, I think that was another part of it too, we're in this like super historical space right there, or place, and just to be there with Rashetta, who's like just a powerful woman to begin with, fantastic professor, and yeah. And then, walking us through how to decipher these civil rights photos, it's just a really powerful thing.
And I remember in our conversation last time, I was saying, well, what about the shows that were there? And I remember you said with the undergrad, and I was like, well, yeah, sure. And you were like, no, not very much. But what about with grad school? Because that was where the really amazing exhibition space was, and where they were doing some really ambitious shows.
Yeah. I would say that, there's not a whole lot that I even remember, honestly, from grad school. I don't even recall much of what was in my own studio, but Ben Butler's show was a very impactful show for me. I remember...
and then, just out of curiosity, what was it about that show?
Oh my gosh, the patience and the time for the multiple parts to his pieces, seeing how everything was kind of structured and put together. And he had his drawings there too, which you could just get lost in. I mean, they're so meditative, and they remind me a little bit of Hiroyuki Doi's, like the tiny circles, and he's got the little bitty lines and the grids. And I just think they were absolute perfection and exquisite. And then seeing how that translated. I think what I loved so much about his show was seeing how he was working 2D and 3D, because I absolutely love that those artists that are able to work, Gita Bradescu or Phillida Barlow, and some of these artists that are able to work 2D and 3D, kind of go back and forth within their practice. I really loved that, and see like where are those? They're not the same. He's not doing a drawing of, but what are those elements that kind of cross over and are repetitive? And it is, for him, it is a lot of repetition.
Yeah, for me, I worked with Ben for a little bit at Rhodes, and we did that show together. And for me, the thing that I love about Ben's work is how, I mean, really, I think he might be the source of that thing that I go to all the time with my students, which is that if-then, where you say, okay, if this is going to be your parameter, then you do this, and Ben kind of basically just lays that out and says, okay, so I start here, and then I go here, and then I'm done when it's done. And so there's this kind of like internal logic to it, but then also almost like a natural rightness, like he was telling me about that book, on growth and form. And it's basically a textbook. There's not a lot of imagery in it, but basically it is sort of the way, conch shells grow, or fern leaf fronds grow. It's like a real kind of natural way of crystallization. And there's such a logic to his work, I think, like when you look at it, and a rightness to it, and then also that thing about patience, and being very patient and trust. There's so much trust in what he does, because there is so much patience. It's like that that's going to happen.
And care.
Yeah.
And care, because, care requires time.
Yeah, and then that kind of goes to that great line about undivided attention is prayer. And so all of that kind of fits in there for me with Ben. Yeah. I mean, to me, I just remember those shows being so ambitious and so varied. And I remember, I can't remember when Cynthia stopped doing those shows, but I remember she did them briefly. And then they did the thing where they announced their fiscal insolvency thing, and then she left. But I can't remember when that was. Do you remember when that was? I feel like that was also when Howard left.
Yeah, I feel like that was before I graduated.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
But I just remember her shows were really ambitious, and as a curator, she had such a different mission than mine. In part because I think she was really motivated by group shows, and really motivated by how these group shows could kind of come together to form a theme. Whereas I was way more interested in just working with a person. But yeah, I remember those shows were so ambitious. And then I also remember that the MFA thesis exhibitions were also particularly ambitious. What do you remember about the thesis exhibition for you? Because that was also in the large space, right?
Goodness. I remember such a variety. We had Sarah Ahmed, who was doing a big installation. I think she put in she'd go to the trouble of a false floor, but she did, floor covering, but it was completely like immersive, her pieces on the wall. And she I really learned a lot from her, because she had a team working for her installation. She was doing a lot of work on the computer to design, and then the laser cutter to cut all that out. But she had fabricators. And so I was like, okay, mental note that like, this is how you do the great big pieces,
Right.
Which really, of course, helped her when she went on to do the Tulsa residency, and then let's see, who else was in that show? I think Michelle Fair was in that show too. Was doing like some hyperrealism, and it was really interesting to go all semester seeing a lot of maybe the smaller things that she was doing. And then how it is, we see it with our students too. One person gets the itch to do installation, and then everyone's like, I want to try installation. And so it was really cool to see how she was able to enlarge her pieces to be more installation-like, and take up a little corner and have it look like her paintings were kind of, fragmented on the wall in some way. We had, who else was in that show? Bob Guthridge. He had his, he's passed away now, but he had his, he had been a concert photographer, and he did the the heads with the little vignettes inside them, or like the dioramas in each head. That was kind of based on a political cartoon type. There was some humor to them, and so those were really interesting too. He and I ended up going on to do Art Prize in Grand Rapids together. He was telling me about the Art Prize competition, and I was like, oh, why not? It was the first thing that I applied to right out of grad school. And then I got in, and that's when I was like I was a finalist for the $250,000 prize with the installation that I did for grad school. But, I think overall, I don't want to call anyone out. There was one person who was not playing well with the rest of us for that show, and they even had a title of their show within the show, which was very interesting. Yeah, if any of my fellow students, they'll know exactly who I'm talking about. Or you can find his Wikipedia page with this information.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Okay, so you had that experience with grad school, and then how did you feel like once you finished with school? Like for me, I was totally confident and stupid in my leaving grad school. What about you? How do you think about that time after grad school for you?
I was like, I wasn't ready for it to end. I wasn't. I think a lot of time, like in grad school too, I was a single mom, newly single mom, struggling to pay bills, working a full-time job, trying to get to my studio. So I didn't get to socialize a whole lot. I'm like, you got parental duties, you have homework to do. Like it was just work. There was not a whole lot of downtime for anything social. So I kind of stayed in that mode right out of grad school. It just kind of became a way that I was used to working. And so I applied for my first residency and got that. That was the art bio in Puerto Rico that I did, working with biologists. And and then again, like having that experience with Dr. Corson, and then the person who was leading our residency in Puerto Rico, Saul, he was a PhD as well. And so things just kept kind of pushing me. It's like I'm wanting to read theory still because it was doing something. It wasn't that I didn't even really see how my work was relating to it at all. I just was like, I want to figure this out. I'm really fascinated. And I did always really like philosophy. I studied a lot of philosophy in undergrad, and and I just kind of kept thinking like, maybe I'm not really done with school yet. I feel like I just learned how to learn. That's how I felt. I feel like I was just learning how to learn. And like now it was just, I want to keep learning, but I want to have the proper people to teach me, and not just kind of go off on my own doing it.
Okay. All right. So I want to talk about Puerto Rico, but I also want to backtrack just a little bit. So when you were talking about the theory and not being quite done with it after grad school, what were some things that you were particularly interested in terms of the things that you were reading or thinking about during grad school?
Well, I took a trauma theory class specifically that was on like trauma literature. And again, that was kind of like hitting all the right points for me, along with like the House St. Pierre visit and, kind of exploring these uglier materials in art, and the trauma theory reading about like Comfort Women, for instance, was a really important book for me at the time. And I think with the theory, that was a really big one. The biopic specifically, because to see the difference between like when it's packaged into a movie, when someone's story is packaged into a movie and retold to maybe appeal better to a wider audience, versus like what the authentic true story might be. Cole Porter was one in particular who we were studying that was really fascinating, like that difference between like the book and the movie on his life. And then but the trauma theory was just and that's when I was introduced to who was I reading back then? Some Alice Walker, so just I'm sorry, like my brain's going right back there to that now. That was a really heavy class, but I just felt like there was more to it. Trauma theory was just like one little section of it, and it's a hard place to kind of sit and stay in for that long. But there were other, trauma theory kind of opened me up to like feminist, racial theory, queer theory, all these other different branches that, when you're just doing art to show and to sell, you're not really maybe reading about those things as much if you have an audience that's like, now, again, I don't want to call anything out, but there's a very specific audience that is going to like your work, and they're not really interested in those kinds of topics and things that you're thinking about. So, it just was like, I want to learn more. This is stuff that I feel like I kind of pushed aside for so long. And then and really what I learned in the dissertation writing was that it was just a deconstruction of myself through all of that.
Okay. All right. Well, now tell me about this Puerto Rico thing. And I love how you were like, well, I'm a single mom. I got a full-time job and blah, blah, blah. And then you were like, and then I went to Puerto Rico. And so what was this trip to Puerto Rico? What was the mission of the residency program?
Well, it was a art bio residency. So it was a directed residency. Okay. It was very structured. There was a small group of us that went. It was led by a husband and wife team, and they were both from Puerto Rico. And so we were going there to be introduced to like collection materials, scientific tools, different things that they would use in their scientific practice and research. So examining things under a microscope. We were out in the desert capturing scorpions, one night. That's when we took scuba boards out to the coral reefs to draw the coral reefs underwater. So a lot of it was just to kind of expose us to these different parts of Puerto Rico too. So a lot of work like doing site-specific ephemeral installation in El Yunque, for instance, which, was a lot of fun because we had to pick tropical flowers and then create something that could blend into the environment, but then also might grab someone's attention as they were walking by, So every location we had an assignment to do a site-specific installation in that assignment, in that location. So it was like the beach. Me and Christina Carfora, who was another artist that was on residence with me, we did a piece in the water, that was like moved with the waves off a beach, and then there was another installation in the desert. So.
And how long was that one? 3 weeks?
No, that one was just 1 week.
Oh my gosh! Okay, so you had that one for a week,
one.
And then what else was going on after you finished with school?
As soon as I got back from Puerto Rico, that's when I started to research PhD programs. Again, after the classes with Keith, and then like Saul, his research was on this little gecko. Like all of his dissertation was on this little bitty gecko in Puerto Rico, and I was just so fascinated by it. Like he wrote a whole book on this one gecko, and I'm like, that's incredible to just know that, be so deeply invested in this little bitty animal and know every little aspect of it. And I thought, I want to learn how to research like that. I want to learn how to, how do I find resources? Where do I even, how would I go about doing that if it was going to art? It's not just about researching artists that I love, but topics that I'm interested in. How do I fall in love with a theory or an idea or a science, or what's happening in the world, and really have all these avenues to explore. And so at the time, the work that I was gravitating towards the most was trauma theory, which I didn't know what that would look like when I went to the PhD program, but I went ahead. I was looking for PhDs that would accept MFA students, and there aren't very many of them. And then I found the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts, which was started as a pilot program at Brown University and then branched off and became their own, where our campus was Colby College outside Skowhegan, and we've got a relationship with Skowhegan. And so that's when I applied and I got in and started that fall.
Okay. Before we get into that, I'm super curious. What do you think? Like, I'm trying to get to the question of thinking about this research. And what is it that you think? I mean, because you mentioned Keith and you mentioned seeing the gecko doctor thinking about this subject. What do you think it was, or what do you think was in the seed that was in Lisa that made you made that seed grow, that made you want to pursue this line of research, or not necessarily this line of research, but just research in general?
I think I think a lot of it has to do with my family. You know, my dad prides himself on being a historian. You know, and he's really, everything he was speaking to us about growing up was all rooted in history. So this deep research into the subjects that he loved, of course, you know, might say they're like one direction or maybe biased in some areas, but I always loved listening to how knowledgeable he was about, and that he would have one bookcase filled with just the same topic, you know, this really close reading, close looking at these subjects that he was interested in. And so I think that was one part of it for me. I think that I'm someone who I have ADD, someone who never had it treated when I was younger. I wasn't even diagnosed until after I got my PhD. You kind of bounce around, you know, it's hard to like draw the water down to the roots, you know, for other subjects, because you just like lose interest really fast, or bouncing around from topic to topic, or you're doing a fast look or trying to get information in quickly. You know, I don't know what accounts for all that, but I was really like yearning to understand, like, what does that look like when people can just slow down and really take these things in, you know, and now I understand it, you know, that I've incorporated a meditation practice in, and that's a big part of it too. You know, maybe I didn't need the PhD to learn how to do that, and just need to meditate a little bit. But I think that it's just this desire to slow down, to like have an excuse. But I'm always someone that needed an excuse to do it. I always felt a lot of guilt if I did it just for myself on my own. And I think that's a gift that grad school gave me too, that I don't feel selfish doing that. I can do that for my own, that being an artist doesn't mean you have to be cranking out paintings like a factory, that it does, your work days do include research days, and they do include museum days, and they do include, you know, slow looking, and maybe they are a walk through the woods or something, and that it doesn't require you to have to be just at the grind making stuff that, you know, someone's going to sell for you, you know. So yeah, I just wanted to learn how to do that.
And so talk a little bit about when was it that the PhD work started? What year was that?
2016.
Okay, so that was around the time that you and I started working together. Okay. And so I'm curious, how did you navigate the PhD and all of the other things? Because it's a remote thing, or not remote, whatever you call it.
Low residency.
Low residency.
Yeah.
And so there's that aspect, and then when a person does that, they have to have a really strong sense of self-motivation, because it's real easy to kind of let it slide by the wayside. And so I'm curious, what were some things that were particularly impactful for you in terms of working on the PhD? Because you went through that in 5 years, 4 years?
5.
5.
Course,
okay.
No, 6, because 3 years of coursework and 3 years to write the dissertation.
And so what did the coursework look like for you?
I mean, if you're familiar with Immanuel Kant, that was the very first like critique of taste, was like the first book that we got into, or Judgment of Taste. It was like I went through the whole, first semester thinking I was maybe not in the right program. It was just so much new language. I think that was another hard part for me too, was I wanted to read, art journals and art critiques, and I felt so disconnected from the language. It's like going up to like high academic language and then softening it some to where, a regular person can read it, but it was still like a little bit like, I'm not sure I know what they're talking about still. And so, I had to get to that high academic language myself first. And that was, I get to the point where I'm like highlighting everything, underlining everything, where I'm like, it's the whole book. I just highlighted the whole book, really. Tabs on everything. I'm a very, I love color coding, organizing. So getting into these books was just, I kind of treated it as an extension of my art form, and just how I organize thoughts and ideas and have my color coded binders and note taking. And, I take my notes in sketchbooks because if I'm having a hard time understanding something, I'm drawing it. So there are like a lot of my residencies that, when we would do our residencies out of the country, those journals are a lot of drawings of the lectures, just so that I could commit it to memory a little bit better.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so you did the Kant thing, and I like how you describe it that way. But surely there was something that clicked in there pretty fast, where you were like, "Oh yeah, this is it. This is good."
Yeah, completely unraveled everything I'd ever learned, about my life and myself. That's what philosophy does. It just completely. It's almost like, grad school, I have to go through this complete deconstruction. And then the PhD was almost like a slow reconstruction. It's like, okay, we just shook all that out and completely upended your ideas of art and who you are as an artist and the things that you want to make. And now adding these parts back in to teach you how to do that. And so that's really kind of what the PhD felt like. I got it completely for personal fulfillment. It's not it's not, nor should it be a terminal degree for visual artists. That's kind of completely ridiculous to make it a terminal degree. But
well, just out of curiosity, I totally get that thing that you're saying. You did it out of a sense of a need for personal fulfillment, and I like that idea of the challenge. And then, of course, I also like the idea of this kind of terminal degree challenge. And then I also recognize that there's an itch that kind of research satisfies for you. But what do you think?
Okay, there is something else.
Okay.
Now that you just... So I used to be a marathon runner, and I coached marathon running. And the PhD felt like marathon running for me. And when I hit a mark, it's like, okay, I'm very aware of how limited our time is on this earth and how many things I want to do while I'm here. And I had an ex-boyfriend in college tell me one time, he introduced me one time to a table he was waiting on at Ronnie Grisani's, and he said, "You've got to meet my girlfriend. She's the most interesting person you'll ever meet." And I wasn't that interesting. I was 19 years old, how we're not that interesting then. But that put in motion for me, like, I'm going to live the most interesting life I possibly can. I want to do absolutely everything. He's still a friend of mine today too, mainly only for that compliment, but
That's so funny, because as soon as you said that thing about, we have a finite period of time on Earth, there was a huge gorilla in my head that was like, well, then you're not getting a PhD, Hamlet. You don't have time for that. But I love how that was the thing that was in your brain where you were like, well, yeah, I don't have that much time, so I need to get a PhD.
Yeah.
And what were some other things? Like, I'm curious, one of the things I love about talking to people who have really specialized fields of investigation, like you were talking about your friend with the gecko. I mean, that's the way it was in Rome. I would sit down at a table and I would be like, well, so what do you study? And they would be like, well, there was this poem that Homer wrote, and I don't know if you know this or not, but Homer had a donkey. Now, the guy who sold Homer the donkey was this guy named Phil, and I study Phil. And it's like, what?
It's so
I don't understand.
fascinating.
How did you get to Phil?
Yeah.
And I mean, of course I'm being ridiculous, but that was kind of how it was,
Yeah.
And so I would just be like, okay, how did you get there? And then the person would just spend the next 2 hours telling me about it.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious. I mean, for me, the thing that I think is interesting is that, you had these early experiences with these people who were researchers or deep divers. And I know, like, a part of the PhD is of course saying, I'm interested in blank. And then seeing where your study, where you're seeing which one of these paths in the forest is the most fruitful and which one leads to a place that maybe other people haven't been to in that moment. And so just out of curiosity, what were some things that moved you towards your dissertation?
I think my dissertation really was, and a lot of my art starts as an argument. That's not something that goes into an artist statement, but a lot of my art starts as an argument. It is an argument against something somebody said to me or something that happened, and that's kind of the jumping off point that will get me fired up. So the dissertation was definitely arguing, people who, one, called me stupid when I was younger, for sure. And then just the whole, I love my parents, love my dad, but he's a lost causer when it comes to the Civil War. And so when I started to kind of tiptoe into like, okay, trauma theory, what does this look like? I'm interested in talking about racial theory, but I'm not going to be able to ever speak from the perspective of a BIPOC person. I can definitely speak from the perspective of a white person, and what are those conversations that need to be happening that aren't happening right now. And they were around it was super topical at the time because, Trump was president as I'm writing my dissertation. We have the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm noticing that every conversation is starting around the Confederate sculptures, that's, portrayed in the media. We're seeing like these are kind of like the new ground zero for these battles. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I started, was just like, it was started as an argument against, because, and then part of me is like, I don't want to persuade, like big P, persuade people over to my side, be big P political, when you're writing academic, you have to be nuanced. You have to say things like, while I understand your point, da 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 da, nevertheless, and then bring it back around to, you don't want to say your opinion, but maybe why your stance is the more correct. But
also to acknowledge that there is a huge part of the population or an argument that is being made for side A or side B.
Right.
And so in thinking about your side or your particular point of view, it's good to have that in there as well. And so that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. It sounds like, yes, the argument, and also the study led you that way, but also, of course, the world sort of led you in that way.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, in those moments, what did those moments look like for you? Like you were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, for me, I remember that really sort of beginning when I got back from Rome. That was in August of 14, and that was when Michael Brown was killed, and that was when everything was sort of happening in Ferguson. And I remember, the way I remember most things, brushing my teeth and listening to NPR and kind of getting ready for the day, and just how much of the NPR conversation was centered on that. moment, and then of course everything else in the news was sort of centered in that moment.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what was it about that time that was particularly impactful for you?
There was kind of a real synergistic moment where I was in Berlin, studying the Holocaust memorials, and I had a talk with the president of our school, who was, who would teach some of our lectures, and then would sit down with us each individually and ask us, what our topic, what we were thinking about for our topic. And this was before our dissertation workshop, or our dissertation residency, where we would actually learn how to write this beast. And as we were talking, I'm talking to him about these monuments and memorials, and I'm checking my Facebook in the hotel, and I'm seeing the protests happen around the Nathan Bedford Forrest monument. And then he and I started talking. I think I had just seen it before my meeting with him. And so when we got to talking, it just started to kind of click into place. And so when I left that conversation, I was like, well, I don't know what my dissertation's actually going to be, but I know what direction I'm going to start heading in first. So whenever, not to toot my own horn, but I was one of the earliest to graduate in my class. We there's that great book, Baby on the Fire Escape, that talks about mothers in a state of constant interruption, and my state of working is preparing for interruption. So I'm chopping away at this dissertation as quickly as I possibly can, because not just these interruptions, but there's such an extreme sense of urgency to get this work done, to get it out, to be this is, people have got to read this. I've got to be lecturing on this, and I have since, but we've got to be talking about these things, because this is a really serious issue right now that's happening. And I had to, what's interesting too is how many times I had to go back in and rewrite passages, because I would be talking about one statue and then it would be removed, or that there would be some legal, something legal going on around it. And then I finally had to start to insert those, pending future,
Right.
So it was really, really topical and organic and constantly moving. It was it's a living document as I'm working on it.
And then thinking about that, you're at this time, you're still making art, you're still teaching, you're still parenting, you're doing all of these things. I'm curious, how did that work fit in, the PhD work, fit in with what you were thinking about and working on in the studio at the time?
I think that was the hardest part for me, because it didn't at all. It felt so completely separate. My studio practice started to feel like a reprieve from the writing. It felt like it was, scratching a different part of my brain that I needed. This is really heavy stuff. We're talking about white supremacy. I'm having to go through this whole reckoning about, myself, my role, my family, and then watch what's happening. I'm being really sensitive to what's happening in the news. It's really affecting me. I'm having to shut the news off, and that's when all my work switched to abstraction because, going from all that trauma response work in grad school, that was, using blood and using strips of my wedding dress. And, it was all very, I felt very aggressive, as I'm working on it. Now, I just want to play with water and materials. And, I dive into a spiritual practice at the same time to sort of start the healing process from some things that are coming up for me at that time too, around my subject. And so, yeah.
Now I'm curious, when you say a spiritual practice is sort of building up, talk about that a little bit. I'm curious how that fits into the practice, but then also in terms of maintaining a kind of life balance.
So, right now, again, in my kind of fluidity with it, I don't can't say that I'm like subscribed to one or another, but I work with a shaman. I work with 2 shamans actually. I'll go down to Magnolia Monastery, Magnolia Grove, and do the days of mindfulness. And then, I try to implement those in my studio practice. If I'm going to put on a drum track and just, is there something that's bothering me at this moment, and I need to just kind of meditate on it and see if there's something deeper that comes up that I'm not considering, or new perspective that I need to look at. And that helps with my art. I feel like there was a lot of work that I was doing specifically around trauma in the beginning, because when I started to develop a spiritual practice, it was with the dissertation writing, where I kind of completely left like Christianity, and I had already, for a while, but where I'm like, no, I'm moving in a different direction. I'm not just like flailing, but this is something that I'm really interested in and has been helpful. Now I feel like my questions they're bigger. They have more to do with my artistic practice. Lately, everything that I'm doing, all the questions that I ask, and, working with the shamans, have to do with my creative practice and in mindfulness, to just kind of slow myself down, to really, be present. But that's really, that's where the ideas of energy start to kind of come up in my work. They're not divorced from the dissertation work. They're really just, I'm understanding the extension. The high academic word is that hermeneutic aperon. The spiritual angle is infinite energy. They mean the same thing.
What? Hermeneutic aperon? What is that?
Infinite interpretation.
Okay. Okay. And then we just have a few minutes left, and I do want to ask. I do want to think about family. You mentioned the kiddos, and I'm curious. And you mentioned them sort of in terms of like, obviously the feeling of responsibility, but also in terms of like being a mom and how different that is. And so I'm curious, what are the ways that you feel like being a parent or having 2 children, how do you feel like that's impacted your practice?
One is just the way that I work, again, structuring my time, for sure. I remember, the woman that I was, Anne Lewin Benham, who I mentioned, the Johns Hopkins. I remember her telling me one time when she was working on the Children's Museum in D.C. how she was actually the founder of that Children's Museum and then opened the school. She's a super busy lady, and she had a son. And telling me when we were working on the school, like, that she regrets being a working mom because it took her away from her son so much, and thinking about if she had to do it again, or if she would do it again if she could. And so that's always in the back of my mind, being thrown into being a single parent. That wasn't my choice exactly. I mean, it was, but it wasn't. It was going to be much worse for my kids to stay in the situation. And having 2 daughters, I think I'm just super fortunate in that regard, because one, they're the best of friends, so they definitely lean on each other. But the 3 of us together, I feel like, I'm learning how to do this, being strong, being independent, having this life-work balance. And, by doing it myself, I can demonstrate that to them as well. I think it's I think the most difficult time for us was during quarantine, of course, like during the COVID times, and, mental health struggles still for the whole family as a result of the divorce, has been a real learning curve, but I think for me, I'm just really very, I'm very aware of how I know they're getting older, and there's a sadness that I feel like, oh, we're not going to get to go to the zoo together for hours like we used to, and take these long walks together. And it makes me a little sad because they don't even remember us having lunch with the polar bears every single day for like 5 years, but to see who they are now and how confident they navigate like the zeroed in focus, on the things that they're excited about and that they want to do, or even when they say like, I'm going to take a break right now for self-care. I mean, I think that these are things that I try to model to them. And also I've learned so much from them in return. It's like I feel maybe some of the, one of the things that I've had to do in being a student, myself for so many years, is hold boundaries with everybody. I can't parent out of guilt or shame or give you everything I have because I feel bad. I still have to reserve these things for myself. And as a result, the girls have very good boundaries. They're very good at exercising them with me too, which I love. So.
Great. Okay. That's cool. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Hamlet.
Yeah, man. And that was the second of 2 interviews that I did with Lisa Williamson. This interview was recorded on March 22nd, 2024. Please join us next week when we have another interview. Thank you for listening.